Hey Mel, we're getting ready to go back together with your 700R4, so I wanted to give you a thorough rundown of everything we're going to be doing with the transmission, all the parts we're going to be installing, including the parts you provided, and for context and the sake of others watching, give some tips and pointers to those looking to build up a 700 for this sort of use case. So for broader context, this is going into Mel's 1970 Chevelle. It's got a beautiful all-white paint job, and it's equipped with an engine making close to 600 horsepower. So we want to make sure we build up the 700 to be survivable in that type of application. Now, it's going to be mostly used as a cruiser, kind of a driver, show car, etc., but he is going to have fun with it. So we need to ensure that it's beefy enough, so to speak, in key areas to be able to withstand that kind of power. So let's go ahead and get closer to the bench, kind of start off at the right side with the brain and the heart of the transmission, the valve body and the pump. So hydraulics are the foundational basis for the success of any transmission, and obviously 700R4s, 4L60Es are no different. So one of the things we want to do is dramatically update and upgrade the valve body. So we'll start off with a throttle valve plunger and sleeve kit from Sonics. I've been installing all of these into all my 700s, this kit or the other version of it, the high performance variant that allows for wide open throttle 3/4 upshifts. So I may go with that one in here. I may not. I have that version in the drawer somewhere. So I'll have to dig it out. But either way, a common problem with 700R4s is insufficient line rise, and a majority of the time, or at least a sizable fraction of the time, when that happens, it's the stock plunger and sleeve that is worn out. So you'll have good pressures at idle, minimum TV, but when you go full TV, your line rise will be anemic or not at all. And so this usually fixes that problem. Okay, we're going to install Transgo 700R4 Junior Shift Kit. This kit contains, among other things, a no-stick TV valve. So for those of you that are struggling to get consistent line pressure, or you're seeing erratic readings, a lot of times it's the throttle boost valve or TV valve sticking in the valve body. So Transgo's valve kind of overcomes that and ensures that you don't have that problem when you go back with the transmission. All right, we're also going to install a hydraulic lockup kit. This is a 100% mechanical lockup kit for the torque converter clutch. So these first generation 700 valve bodies, you can install them prospectively onto later cases. In other words, the 87 and up auxiliary valve body units that took a second design valve body from the factory. And what that'll do is it will allow you to run a 100% mechanical torque converter clutch apply setup without having to run wires or install internal, external lockup kits or anything like that. It's just purely governed by the valving in the valve body working in concert with the TCC apply valve in the pump. Okay, we're going to install a governor kit. So most of the governors for 700R4s are not really set up for high performance. I mean, they're just in, more or less daily driven applications where engine power was, relatively small compared to what it is today, and where cams were designed more for emissions control and, fuel economy versus pure performance. So a lot of times you're going to have wide open throttle shift points that are insufficient for high performance setups, especially if you have a numerically high gear ratio in the axle. So we'll go ahead and calibrate it so that the shift points are in phased and in tune with the rest of the setup. All right, so kind of working our way to the left. Let me talk about well, first let me cover the separator plate. So Transgo 700P, any kind of high performance build, this is what I'm installing. I love this plate. It basically allows you to customize your configuration based on whatever valve body you're using. And they give you some instructions along with a couple of slugs, which you can kind of see here in the instructions on the, right here in the front. And they tell you exactly where you need to install those slugs based on the valve body that you're using. So factory plate's fine, but for something like this, we just want to kind of start fresh, put a heavy duty plate in there, and the Transgo 700P is the way to go. All right, so let's talk about the heart of the transmission, and that is the pump. So always start out with freshly machined castings, and in this case, I'm going to be replacing the stator with a brand new one. There's really nothing wrong with this stator, I'll be honest. I mean, if this was a more of a mild performance or even factory deal, I wouldn't hesitate to reuse that stator. But again, because of what we're doing here, it only makes sense to start fresh. So one of the problems you'll have, in particularly high horsepower, high RPM applications, is the splines here starting to wear. And so if you notice on the original stator, you can see a lot of that starting to happen. I mean, like I said, it's not too bad, but there's no reason to reuse something like this in a build, like what we're going together with here. Okay, so for the pump body, a pump body bushing from Sonics. You'll see I have two of these on the bench, one for the pump body and another for the reverse input drum. So you may not know it, but the diameter for the pump body bushing and the rearward position in the reverse input drum, that bushing, are identical. So you can put Teflon coating bushings in here, either the Sonics version or the standard one that comes in the bushing kits from the aftermarket. That's also Teflon coating, and those are black. So those will work well also. All right. I always drill out my drain back 5/16, so that will ensure efficient drain of fluid back to the sump and prevent the seal from blowing out. 700R4s, 4L60Es is not a huge problem, but for, again, high RPM, high performance, you want to make sure that you mitigate risk in all possible areas, and this is one of them. All right, we have a TCI governor cover. The customer had provided this to me. In fact, it just came in today, so we'll kind of leave the dirty, nasty cover on the bench, and we'll install the TCI governor, and it will look real good on there. Governor cover, I should say. All right, let's talk about hydraulics in the pump stator support. So this is the stator support, this is the stator, and then we have some valving here. This is all of the original valving. So everything that you see on this shop towel, other than the anti-clunk spring, let me get that out of the way, is not going to be reused. We are not going to be reusing the spring. A new one will come in the shift kit. Even the pressure regulator valve, I'm going to be reaming this casting out for the Sonics oversized PR valve, is what I do per my standard, really high performance build. So this is what that looks like. This is Sonics part number 77917-06. You do need the reamer kit for this, so this will not drop in place of the factory valve without reaming. Okay, so we're going to pair that with a TCC apply valve. So this is for all non-PWM applications. So 700R4, 4L60E early, 9394, and the 204R. Okay, we're also going to install a boost and reverse boost valve kit from Sonics. These are the O-ring versions. So 1/2-inch boost valve and 283 reverse boost valve. And as you can see, maybe you can't see they're in packages, but I'll flash a picture on the screen of what these look like compared to these valves, and you'll see that the ratios are dramatically larger. So that's ideally what you want. So the lockup springs here will go back in. The spring stop, the snap ring, and this snap ring will go back in. That's basically it as far as what originally came out of this pump. All right, let's talk about servo and accumulators. So we're going to install a 100% end-to-end billet servo assembly from Sonics. You have your second gear super hold servo, as well as your fourth gear super hold servo. The second gear servo comes with a pin. This pin will need to be ground, so you basically grind it to fit your clearance. And ideally, you want no more than 3/16 of an inch travel of the band along the drum, and no less than about 1/8 or so. Ideally, you want to run it down as tight as you can without the band binding on the reverse input drum when you're spinning the output shaft counterclockwise. I mean, that's ultimately the litmus test, and you have to do that with the case fully assembled. Okay, for accumulators. So we have our second gear accumulator here. This is the accumulator housing, and we have a new piston in there. I'm undecided if I'm going to roll with this or if I'm going to put a pinless accumulator on there and roll with that instead. Now, if you install a pinless accumulator piston and you do everything else, keep everything else constant, your 1-2 upshift will be a little firmer, as well as your 3-2 downshift, all other things held equal. So what I may do is give him, an accumulator housing separate from the one I installed in the transmission to give him a quick, swappable, easy to tune 1-2 shift if it's either slightly on the soft side or slightly on the harsh side. So you always got to tune that 1-2 shift. And I learned recently doing another 700R4 for a customer that if you have a real aggressive gear ratio and a cam where the stall speed is kind of underneath the ideal stall speed range for the cam, you really, really need to be conservative with the 1-2 shift. So in the spacer plate, I would recommend not drilling out the 1-2 feed at all if you're not sure. You know, you can always add, or I should say, you could always remove metal, but it's very hard to add it back. I mean, you can peen the plate, but I mean, it's just extra work. So, all right. So for the pump body, we'll come back to that. We have Transgo unbreakable pump rings. Comes with an updated priming spring or slide spring. So we do away with the dual spring setup, and we replace it with Transgo's single spring setup, which incidentally, GM went to that same setup or a spring identical to it in later model 4L60Es. Okay, we have a brand new pump kit, so that complements the freshly machined castings. So we are starting with a 100% reman and updated pump assembly here. All right, so let's talk about frictions and band. So we're gonna go high energy throughout the entire transmission, except for the 3/4 pack, which we're going to be doing Alto Reds. All right, so in the reverse input drum, whenever you are wanting to run a wide band such as this Alto Red band, you must have a virgin surface here. So my recommendation is to simply buy the drum new. You can machine or turn the drum if it's used, but the problem with that is, number one, this surface can get real inconsistent, especially if the drum's been through hard times, been, you know, severely warped or burnt, or the, you know, metallurgy with that particular drum is no good. The other problem is you have a lot of lug wear. It's very common to see excessive wear on these lugs. So it's like you're really polishing a turd if you're trying to turn the drum. And for the amount of money it's likely to cost you, a new drum is going to not cost you much more than maybe another 20% over and above that. And you get a vastly superior product. And, you know, again, you're mitigating risk that much more relative to the money you're spending. So my recommendation is always to just purchase a new reverse input drum whenever you're going back with any of these transmissions, 700R4s, 4L60Es, and for the 204Rs, the equivalent will be the direct drum. All right, master bushing kit. So I've always replaced bushings in the transmission everywhere. And again, that aforementioned pump body bushing that can go right here. So I'm gonna pull this bushing out and we'll install this one in its place. All right, let me talk about this little set screw and come back to accumulators real quick. So this is a 1/4 inch set screw. I would say it's about maybe 3/8 of an inch long. We're gonna take that set screw and we're gonna thread it into the 4th accumulator feed here at the bottom of the 4th accumulator piston bore. So that's right there. Let me get that in focus for you. And all you need to do is thread it in and it will self-tap. And if you want, I mean, you could take it out, put a little Loctite or RTV on it, but it's totally unnecessary in my opinion. But that will block off that 4th accumulator for you so that you don't have to worry about managing or trying to calibrate your 3/4 upshift. I mean, it's just done. And so then you drill the plate out based on your converter stall, gears, and of course preferred shift firmness for the customer, you know, whether it's you or somebody else. All right, so, you know, had to kind of circle back there to the 4th accumulator. Didn't really discuss it when we were discussing the 2nd accumulator, but we'll continue on with the rest of the main case. As you can see, we have hyper blue bonded piston kits. You always want to pair this sort of upgrade for any 700R4 or early 4L60E with your second design dual retainer return spring assembly for the forward drum. And there's a part number 242-06085. Okay, do not reuse aluminum pistons in any 700R4 or early 4L60E. Okay, it's for the amount of money that it costs to upgrade, it's very minimal. You dramatically reduce the risk of having no movement in drive or D3 because your forward piston cracked, because that is fairly common in these transmissions as well as the early 4L60Es. All right, continuing on with the forward drum and all of its contents. So one of the things that I strongly recommend you do with these transmissions, if power levels exceed 550 horse or so, especially if the application calls for racing. In fact, if it's going to be going down the track, I would probably drop my threshold down to maybe 450, 475, and that is install an aftermarket high-performance drum with a billet steel input shaft. So we'll kind of jump over here, and what we have is an FI Industries billet aluminum forward drum. Okay, now I'm not super familiar with FI Industries. However, from what little bit of research I've been able to do, they seem like they make good quality components. So I'm going to do a separate video on the buildup of this drum, so you'll get to see it in much more detail and see how it goes together. But suffice to say, first impressions are positive. It seems like it's very well made. Okay, so the drum comes as a whole kit. You'll have a billet aluminum third clutch piston, the drum itself, and then you may have noticed a cushion plate here in the reverse input clutch. And that is because this plate is intended to replace the Belleville plate that normally comes in here. And, you know, if you guys have any, you know, kind of experience or, you know, about 700R4s, 4L60Es and high performance applications, real high RPM, the Belleville plates are actually known to crack. So what guys will do is run an old school 700R4 setup with the factory cushion plate and then the, you know, the factory setup with the 80 thou thick frictions instead of the ones that come in the late model stuff. So I believe that particular clutch pack was produced and installed in the reverse input drum from 82 to 86. So all the drums that took the stamped steel piston and, you know, had the kind of smallish square feed hole for the reverse input drum. All right, so that's a forward drum. So what we're going to do is pair it with a whole bunch of other upgrades in the forward clutch. In the forward drum, I guess including the forward clutch too. So first, you want to start off with high rate return springs. So you're going to have your return spring assembly for your 3/4 clutch pack below your forward piston housing. And then you're going to have your forward/post clutch return spring assembly that we just talked about earlier. And you're going to take all the springs out of each of these and replace them with the springs from this Transgo kit. What that does is it prevents centrifugal apply under high RPM, and you want to prevent clutch drag, particularly with the 3/4 clutch, because that's really what these springs are meant for, is to prevent centrifugal apply or clutch drag for your 3/4 clutch pack. So one of the other things that the drum kit comes with is a billet steel backing plate. So what I have here is a 4L65E spec clutch pack, Alto Reds with Lindered steels, and then I also have a couple of additional frictions as well as a couple of additional steels of different thicknesses. So these are the 4L65E steels, and these are 4L60E spec steels. 4L65Es, I think I'm going to say, are like 90 thousandths or something like that, and the 4L60E steels are 106 thousandths. So those are the respective thicknesses. And so it's always a good idea to have some differing thicknesses of either steel, clutch, apply plate or backing plate, and even snap ring on the bench when you're working with aftermarket drums, because it gives you a lot more flexibility, and plus you never know if you need to swap in one component for another to get your clearance where you want it. And the 3/4 clutch, my recommendation is to manage to clearance between 30 and at most 40 thousandths. For this build, I'm going to restrict myself to be between maybe 25 thousandths on the low end and 35 thousandths on the high end, and that is using both the high rate return springs as well as the load release springs in the 3/4 clutch. Because remember, when you're turning at 6,000 plus RPMs behind an engine making at least 500 horsepower or more, that is a lot of potential clutch drag that you have to mitigate. So, you know, kind of bringing as much to bear against the possibility of clutch drag or centrifugal apply is definitely in your interest. All right, and then so for the forward clutch, we're going to go with Alto High Energies, and we're going to do the same for the coast clutch. Okay, you can do choline steels here if you want. I'll be honest, not really necessary. And I mean, choline's great, but I like it for more of a heavy duty application, more so than like purely high performance street strip. And that's just simply because for a purely race vehicle, you know, that's trailer to the track, you're not really going to build up a ton of heat in a chronic manner. You're really going to have heat spikes when the transmission is working as the vehicle's going down the track making a pass, but then it's going to cool off. For a cruiser, it's kind of the same thing in that it's not going to be seeing super intense, prolonged exposure to heat and pressure like, say, a truck would in a towing capacity, something that's trying to tow maybe 1.5 times what one of these transmissions was initially rated for. So, I mean, that's my philosophy and my approach, excuse me, when it comes to using choline steels, but it certainly can't hurt. Pardon me, got a frog in my throat. All right, let's take a look at that billet input shaft real quick. So this is the 298 millimeter version, 300M steel billet shaft that Sonex makes, and these are getting very hard to come by for whatever reason. I don't know when Sonex is going to, deliver another batch to distributors and retailers, but Jegs had this, and they had this, and I think one other one, and they were the only retailer, the only supplier that I could find after searching God knows how many, that actually had one available. So I was fortunate enough to snag it, and, here we are. All right, one-way assemblies. This is going to be a Borg Warner 29 element input sprag, and then we're also going to replace the low roller clutch, which is what you see right over here. And so anytime you're going back together with a transmission, doesn't matter what the use case or application is, always replace your one-way assemblies. All right, output shaft. To my knowledge, there's no billet output shafts or no billet counterparts to these factory ones, but the output shaft in these transmissions are surprisingly stout. I've built 4L60Es and 700R4s for folks making north of 700 horsepower drag race and F bodies, and they were running the stock output shaft, and the shaft was actually surviving, believe it or not. So, they have a lot of power potential and can handle a lot of torque before things get kind of swirly. I mean, eventually you're going to reach the design limit in which this transmission family can reasonably expected to take when it comes to power and torque. And I think that number is probably around 800 to 1,000 horse. Beyond that, it's just best to go with a different unit. 4L60Es, especially the late models, you'll have a little bit more leeway there, a little bit higher horsepower threshold, especially given that the 4L60Es do have billet output shafts available to them made by Sonex. All right, speaking of Sonex, we're going to continue with the Parade of Sonex parts here. So what we have is a billet steel reaction shaft. Okay, this one takes the place of the factory shaft. Comes with a new bushing, and it's, I believe, made of 300M billet steel as well, with heat-treated splines that you can see here. And what it does is for those 704s and early 4L60Es prior to 2003, it adds a Torrington bearing here at this location where there used to be a thrust washer, that would go in the sun shell, that bronze 4-tab washer. And then they also give you a bearing for the front planet as well as a shimmer spacer to tighten up the slop that can exist between the planet and the snap ring here. So if you have a lot of slop, you do want to tighten that up because there is a risk that snap ring can break, again, under high RPM and high horsepower, especially shifting, particularly at wide open throttles. So it's always good to, again, mitigate risk, and that's another risk point. All right, speaking of risk points, we're also going to swap in a bolt-in center support in place of the factory support. Comes with a case saver and also fasteners, and then we have, let me get that in focus here. All right, there's I think like 8 fasteners or something like that. Okay, here's the support itself. It's specifically machined to accept a steel cover plate or top plate or a stabilizer plate. I know I'm butchering the terminology here, but that's what it is. At least that's how it functions. And then the main center support is machined, as you can see here, and threaded for those fasteners. So this little case saver piece takes the place of the anti-clunk spring you saw earlier, and that basically reduces the risk that spring will break under high load or shifting under high RPM with a ton of power going behind it. All right, that's going to be paired with the Sonex Smart Shell that you see here. Again, another bearing to replace a thrust washer. This one replaces the black 4-tab washer that would otherwise go on the low roller clutch inner race. So Sonex provides you a race to come with the Sun Shell. And between that shell and even if you were just to upgrade to a factory 2003 up 4L60E reaction shaft, you'll rollerize the entire middle of the case. So again, a great way to reduce heat and friction and maybe allow a little bit more horsepower to survive to get to the driveline and rear wheels. So again, it's all about risk mitigation and overall transmission efficiency when it's functioning in the vehicle. All right, so rear sun gear. We're going to install a Durabond bushing. I've used the Sonex bushing here. Both of them are the same width, but the Sonex bushings as of late have been, for whatever reason, coming out way too tight. So in other words, I would install the bushing perfectly square, just as you would with a press and a bushing driver tool, but then it would bind up here on the reaction shaft journal where it goes. And I don't know if that's something going on with Sonex's process or if they changed the design slightly, but either way, it's, I think now 5 or 6 bushings have been no good. I've had to spend time clearancing them with sandpaper, and that's a waste of my time as it is yours. So I've sent Sonex an email. I haven't heard anything back. I may get on the phone and talk with one of their tech support folks to see if there's anything that is going on with the bushing, the way it's designed, or if there's something that we need to be doing different. But suffice to say, that one and their rear stator bushing, the Teflon coated red rear stator bushing for the pump, is also been really tight as of late, and I don't know why. All right, low reverse clutch pack, standard, standard stack up, high energy, Alto, you can't go wrong. If you guys that are racing and it's basically a track-only vehicle, gets trailered to and from the track, you can delete a few of those frictions and just put steel plates in place of them, the tubular steels like you see here, and that will kind of cut down on drag, since you don't really need it for reverse as if it was being driven on the street. We're not going to do that here because this is primarily going to be a street vehicle. In fact, as far as I know, he's never going to take it to the track, or at least so he tells me, wink and a nod. But anyway, the debate about the planetaries, 4-pinion versus 5-pinion, here's where I stand on that. I am not convinced that 5-pinion planets are actually better. In fact, I think they're weaker. Numerous builders that I've talked to kind of agree with that sentiment. And the reason primarily for that is that the structure itself never changed between the 4 and the 5-pinion planetary carrier designs. So let's even get this thing in focus so you can at least see what I'm talking about. But basically, this part of the housing is the same for 4 and 5-pinion planets, for the most part. Like, there's not a material strengthening or, beefing up anywhere of the structure. And, you really can't do that unless you completely redesign the entire gear train. The primary reason GM went to 5-pinion planets, at least according to a couple of conversations I've had with Transgo, was that the ring gear, particularly the rear ring gear, would often like to crack. And that's because of the loading wasn't always balanced, especially at higher RPMs. So they redesigned the ring gear to, to kind of beef it up in the back, make it a little more aerodynamic, and then have the 5-pinion planets more evenly distribute the load. So this way, there's minimal risk, or I guess a reduced risk, of this ring gear failing. So I have a factory ring gear that's, kind of the early design, so to speak. I'm actually going to swap this for a late design ring gear so that he has the benefit of, a stronger ring gear for harder launches and higher RPM takeoffs. All right, so customer brought me a deep pan to install. So this came from RevMax, and he also added a nice looking TV cable from Summit. So we'll go ahead and install that for him. This pan comes with its own set of hardware and a couple of different filter pickup extension tubes. So we'll use the tube that best fits this transmission. And of course we have our filter, and then there's other things in there that came as part of the kit. All right, so real quick, here's the case. Cast aluminum, or standard aluminum. We decided to go with that sort of paint job. It is a good match for the all-white Chevelle, and it'll look really nice once it's installed into the vehicle. Between the aluminum paint job and that beautiful aluminum deep pan, this transmission should be a winner for Mel. So Mel, like I said, looking forward to getting into it. I'll keep you posted, and as always, thank you so much for the opportunity. And for everyone else watching, if you have any questions, comments, go ahead and leave them below. If there's anything else you want me to touch on or cover, go ahead and note it, and I will do what I can to make a video. So thanks everyone. Today is July 2nd, so if you're watching this before the 4th, have a great 4th of July holiday with you and your family. Stay cool. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and look forward to seeing you on the next video. Thanks again.